All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you guys very much for coming and your patience with us getting started. How many people in the room, just out of curiosity, have heard Apollo speak before? Oh, you did so well, they came back to see you again. All right. Well, as you've heard before, he's someone who always gets great accolades and does such a fantastic job. For those of you who don't know, Apollo is a vice president with Dimensional Funds, and some of you really understand the connection that we have with Dimensional Funds, but Dimensional was founded by David Booth, who is the namesake for the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago, and effectively is kind of the liaison for firms like us to be able to access information and data about markets, which, of course, as most of you know, drives a lot of what we do in the decision making that goes into our portfolio management. But it's also an extension way beyond that. So for those of you who've been with us for a while, you know that not only does the kind of data-driven mentality manifest in how we invest and how we manage portfolios, but it extends beyond that into how we think about everything. And how we, I believe Eugene Fama said, it's about finding the right answer, not defending the wrong answer, and that was a phrase that has been in my head and I think is really fostered through our relationship with Dimensional. So we're blessed to have a relationship with them and blessed to have Apollo be able to come out and speak again. He's coined the Secretary of Explaining Stuff because he's so good at taking complex concepts and helping investors like us get our arms wrapped around what's going on in the world. So with that being said, he's also able to do a Q&A open format. So one of the great things about when Apollo comes in to speak is that you all get to express the things that are on your mind and concerning to you, and he'll be able to talk on those things and just let you really guide the presentation today. So I do have one mic. Apollo can repeat a question. So if it's on the side of the room and it's going to take too long to get a mic to you, we can just say the question and Apollo can repeat it, and we'll try to make sure that everybody understands what topics that we're talking about. All right? Sound good? Yep. Okay. I'm just gonna. Do you have anything you want to say first?
Well, I mean, thank you so much for the invitation to come back. I mean, it's great fun to be back in Boulder, and not in Boulder, but in actual Colorado. Talk about Boulder because I just saw your shirt, and my son just graduated in May from CU, so I got to go there, and it's pretty impressive. And so thanks for inviting me back. It's always great to see you, and thanks for the trust and the partnership. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, thank you. I'll just get us started with one question, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. But the one thing I wanted to have you speak on a little bit, which, of course, as we go through the year, we meet with all of you, and we walk by the TV in our office, and we hear all the things that the media is talking about. These are the things that we try to use to drive our presentations to understand what's going on in the marketplace. And one thing that is always difficult for us to explain, and so that's why I want to lob it your way so you can help do that, is just the narrative around the dollar, right? We've seen what's happened with gold lately. We've seen lots of talk in the media about the strength of the dollar and maybe the kind of diminishing future when it comes to the U.S. and the reserve currency. And again, we've seen things like Bitcoin and gold as potential hedges for that. So I just wanted to see if you'd be willing to start us off and talk a little bit about your thoughts around, one, how the media, contributes to that narrative, and two, how worried do you think investors should really be about the dollar and the future of the reserve currency?
Well, absolutely. And I think that with the media, I think it's a much more of a general comment that I think the media is doing its job, and I think the media's job is to make money for themselves. And the way they make money is by selling us emotions in a way. Because what keeps us glued to a TV, to anything, is like, the two main emotions that tend to drive our lives when it comes to money. One is fear, and we're anxious when things don't go well, so you kind of find that I need to be glued on because if I pay attention, then I kind of somehow save my financial future. But the other more insidious one is not fear, but fear of missing out, FOMO. because, hey, I don't want to miss out. I want to be part of this, like Bitcoin and all this what's going on. So I think the media is really good at tapping into these emotions and making us watch. And I think it's incumbent upon us to realize that the media is not there to give us advice, but rather to provide entertainment. And it's up to us to distinguish between entertainment and advice. We're not getting advice from the media. It's an entertainment form. If you want advice, talk to Eric and the team. That's who's really giving you advice. And I think that it's not that I want to demonize the media. They're doing their job. The way they make money is sell advertising, but we don't need to confuse entertainment with advice. And that's the first thing that I want to start. But the dollar is a much more interesting, and maybe I'll take a few minutes to do it justice, because it has been a lot on the media. So let's look at the dollar and gold and see kind of a little bit how they tie together and what's going on. Should you be concerned about the standing of the dollar in the world? And to kind of do it justice, we need to kind of go back almost 100 years or so, because back in those days, there was no central unified currency. In fact, every state, every bank issued its own currency. And there was nothing magical about that. You just had some form of a currency. But at some point, the U.S. had its own national currency, the dollar. But people needed to have some confidence that there is value in the dollar, that the government is printing money, but there's just not a piece of paper. There's something backing it up. So back in the early 1900s, there was an election. And on one side was McKinley, and on the other side, I don't remember the other candidate's name, but the reason why it's interesting about McKinley is that McKinley was promoting gold as being the precious metal that is giving the dollar value, that you need to have gold in the bank, and the other candidate was suggesting silver. And obviously McKinley won. And you want to hear an interesting story about McKinley? Anybody who's been to Alaska, to Denali? So when I was at Denali, it was like Mount McKinley and all that. So I asked the guy, why is this called Mount McKinley? Because everybody here calls it Denali. And it turns out there was a prospector who was also a cartographer. And because he was prospecting for gold, and he knew about the election, he said, well, what can I do to help the guy who's promoting gold? And he said, why don't I call this mountain Mount McKinley? Because maybe that gets him some visibility and he gets elected. He had nothing to do with anything. McKinley never set foot in Alaska, never saw the mountain, but that mountain is called McKinley because that prospector and the cartographer wanted to promote his candidacy, and the locals are probably going nuts. Why is this called McKinley? And they try to change it several times, but the Ohio delegation is like, no, McKinley's our guy. We don't want to change that. But that is actually Mount Denali. They tried to change it, and now apparently they got changed back to McKinley, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, that's the story. So McKinley won. And at that point, the U.S. became a currency that was backed by gold. And that gave people confidence that if I hold these dollar bills, there's value, because for every dollar bill, there's some gold in the bank. And that should make us all feel warm and fuzzy that there is value in there. But in the late 60s, something happened. There are a lot more people in the country. The economy was growing tremendously, and we're just not digging up enough gold to print all the dollar bills that we needed. So what do we do then? Well, it turns out that in August of 1971, it turns out that President Nixon goes on TV and he says that as of today, the dollar is no longer backed by gold. And as of today, the dollar becomes something called fiat money, which basically means that the dollar has value not because it's backed up by a precious metal, but because we all believe that the dollar has value. And we somehow trust that the government is not going to be irresponsible in the way that it prints money. A lot of laughter in there. Any of you might have parents, or maybe you remember, how did you feel back when that announcement was made? That must have been a lot of anxiety. You mean we're going to trust the government that they're going to do a good job of not printing money? That was 54 years ago. 54 years ago. If you fast forward 54 years, is the dollar a failed currency? I would say undoubtedly it is not a failed currency, because all of us can go buy roughly the same thing today that we can buy tomorrow, that we can buy yesterday. That is not the case with so many other currencies around the world. so many other currencies around the world, 50 years after this experiment, they would have been a disaster. But the dollar, I think, in my opinion, has held its value. And the reason for that is because we did not entrust the government with printing money. It is not the government that can release money in society, but rather what we did is we gave that responsibility to the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the U.S. So the U.S. government cannot print money, cannot release money in society. The only entity that can do that is the Fed. And for the first decade or so in the 70s, after we made that change, the Fed had a lot of influence from politicians. A lot of political figures, they would go in and say, hey, let's lower interest rates, let's raise interest rates, because it helped them politically. And in the late 70s, a new chairman came along, and his name was Paul Volcker. Anybody remembers the name Paul Volcker? What Paul Volcker did, he basically said, no more monkeying around. I am going to fight fiercely for the Fed to be independent and make decisions not based on political ideas or political whatever benefits you might get, but rather because it's the right thing. It might not be the perfect decision, but we're going to make it based on data and what we think it's right, based on what we know at the time. And since 1980, that has been the regime. The Fed has been fiercely independent and made decisions not because of political interest, but because their own technical analysis. And since the 1980, the average inflation in the US has been about 2%, 2 to 3% per year on average. So to me, that is not a failed currency. The Fed has done a tremendous job, incredible job, keeping us and having value in the dollar. And the biggest thing is independence. And that's why the only reason that truly concerns me personally about the dollar is if the Fed is no longer independent. And there's a lot of political pressure for the Fed to make decisions not because of what they believe, but rather the political interest of a party or individual. And that is truly scary. That's the one scary part, because the Fed needs to be independent, in my opinion, to continue to have the value in the dollar. So 50 years later, I can unequivocally say that the dollar is not a failed currency. And if you look at the dollar in the world today, you hear that the dollar is losing its standing and all that. And I would say you got to put some perspective to that. I don't believe that the dollar right now is on a downhill fall or anything like that, as long as the Fed is independent. And why is that? There are three reasons that I think that the dollar in the world is currently what it used to be, and it's not about to change. It's not to say that at some point it might not change. The British pound was the dominant currency, and it's no longer the dominant currency. So it could change, but at the moment, in the short term, there's nothing that would challenge that. Why? Three reasons. Number one, what is the competing currency? What is the alternative? If it's not the dollar, what do people believe in and trust? And I did an experiment a couple of years ago because we had the similar conversation 2 years ago, and I was in Italy, I was in Greece, or I forgot it exactly. It was somewhere in Europe. And I exchanged some dollars in euros, but also just for kicks, I exchanged some dollars in the Chinese currency, which is the renminbi. And I thought, like, why don't I just run this little experiment where I would go into a store and say, well, I don't have euros, but I can pay you in dollars. And people are like, well, I'm not happy about it, but yeah, I'll make the sale. Yeah, sure, I'll exchange that. I'll take the dollars. I did exactly the same thing in some stores, and instead of dollars, I offered the Chinese renminbi. What do you think their reaction was? And my own candid camera. I mean, like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm not taking this. I'm not taking this. If you're a merchant around the world, what currency would you prefer? Everybody in the world, you folks travel, nobody prefers anything else but dollars, maybe euros, but still the dollar is unequivocally the number one currency that's most trusted because there is no other alternative. If the dollar is not the main currency in the world, what is that currency? Is there such a thing? I don't believe so. That's the first reason. The second reason is that over the past 80 years or so, since after World War II, all the financial pipelines of the world, payment systems, everything that has to do with the financial underpinnings of trade, everything was built on the US dollar. Everything is built on the US dollars. And just to give you a perspective, right now, 88% of all foreign currency transactions involve dollars. 88%. 83% of all trade finance, payments, letters of credit, 83% is in dollars. You know what the next currency is? Euro. You know how much it is? 7%. And the third one is the Chinese renminbi, 5%. Who's going to switch from this? How are you going to change these financial pipelines and build an alternative system of payments that is using some other currency that nobody wants? Is that realistic? And the third reason is that when you hear about the currency, the reserve currency of the world, reserve currency doesn't mean that a country is just going to pile dollar bills and put in the vault. Because if they do that, do they make anything on the dollars? You put the dollar there, is it going to make you anything? No. Would you do that if you're the central bank of any country? No, but let's say you hold dollars. What would you do with those dollars? You invest, and the safest investment at the moment, and we'll talk about it, and it still is the case, are government bonds. Government bonds. So you need to have a government that issues enough bonds so you can put the currency into those bonds. And right now, the U.S. government is issuing roughly about $2 trillion a year in bonds. So all these foreign governments, if they hold dollars, they can buy bonds. They're very liquid. They can convert to cash almost instantaneously. Not a big deal. And there are 2 trillion of them that he can buy. The Chinese government is issuing, anybody guesses how much they're issuing in bonds? So we have 2 trillion. They're issuing roughly about less than 150 billion. So less than a tenth of what we issue. And they have some other long-term bonds that are kind of funky, but the bottom line is that there are not enough bonds if you want to hold the Chinese currency, because if you hold the Chinese currency and you want to buy the bonds, there are just not enough bonds available. So when you think of these 3 reasons, there's nothing in the short term on the horizon to make me think that all this doom and gloom that the media is putting out has anything valid associated with it. So I don't believe at all that this is a real concern at the moment. Could it be at some point in the future? Yes. Again, think of these 3 things. What's the alternative? All the financial pipelines, the SWIFT payments, all of these things are built on the dollar. And number 3 is that it's not just about the dollar, but the bonds. Can you buy government bonds that actually make you interest rather than just put the dollar bills in the vault? And because of 3 reasons, I don't believe that the currency right now, there's any imminent danger for the US dollar. And there's a lot of media who's trying to make you feel otherwise. But because, in my opinion, not only they want to sell fear, but there's even a more insidious group of people who are marketing fear to you because they want to sell you something. They want to sell you gold. They want to sell you some other product as if like there's a financial crisis and everything blows up, like gold is going to somehow help you pay for milk. What are you going to take a bar and start shaving some pieces from? It doesn't make any sense. If you're really concerned about it, go buy a gun and some water and some other things that will really help you survive. But gold ain't it. This gold's not going to help you. Now, you also hear about Bitcoin, and you ask about Bitcoin. How familiar are you folks with Bitcoin? Well, there was a show years ago who kind of put it pretty well. Bitcoin is everything you do not understand about money combined with everything you don't understand about computers. What can go wrong? But if you are interested, we can spend a few minutes to demystify exactly what is Bitcoin and what it's not. Because there are a lot of folks who are being targeted by criminals with respect to Bitcoin. And I just had a client event in Hawaii, and I do the same thing like once a year. And this lady that I've known for several years now kind of came crying and kind of said not too long ago, a few months ago, somebody kind of basically stole half her retirement money through Bitcoin and asked me, how do I get it back? And it was just so sad to see something like that. So there's a lot of fraud going on. But I don't know, are you interested in, is it a topic that comes up, or should you do something else?
Yeah, it's a good topic. Would it be okay? You mentioned China,
yeah.
and obviously the currency and how that compares with the dollar. But one other thing, and you can take this in whatever order you want. This is the beauty of having the mic,
yeah.
I guess. But I do hear lots of concerns about how much of our debt is owned by China, and the potential that China could have some leverage. Is that a topic you can speak on?
Oh, absolutely. So the majority of the debt is not owned by China. China has China owns less of our debt than Japan and Canada. So if you're concerned, talk to Canadians, see how they feel about us. But I don't particularly believe that is a concern, because China has less than like about 750 billion, which is not peanuts, but our debt as a whole. So China has about 750 billion. Our entire debt is $36 trillion. So out of $36 trillion, China has about 750 billion, which is not peanuts. It's just not the majority of it by any means. It's less than the UK, less than Japan. But what's interesting about that debt is that what they owed is just basically they gave us the money and they subsidized our national debt because they bought the bonds, and they kind of said, here's the money. And all they have is no claim to what the US can do and cannot do. All they have is a claim to receive interest on our money. That's all they do. You can't do anything with a bond. It's not ownership in the country. It's just basically, if you have a bond, you can get interest payments on that bond. That's all they can do is wait for the interest payments. Now, let's say that somehow they decide they're going to blow it up. They're going to say, we're going to destroy the US government bonds. Well, what do you think is going to happen to the value of all those $750 billion in bonds that they have? It's going to go down. Are they really? They might be crazy, but they're not stupid. They're not just going to say we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot and somehow lose the value in those bonds. And so there's nothing they can do about those bonds. They can't come and tell us anything because the bonds are already issued, and all they do. A bond is a form of it's a form of lending. It's basically, instead of a country going to a bank and says, lend me money, what they do is they come to investors, and they could be you and I, they could be China, they could be an institutional company, and they say, if you are, let's say, willing to give me $1,000, we will write up a contract, and in that contract we specify a certain interest rate that you'll receive, for how long you get the interest rate, and at the back end you get your money back. That's all. So once you have that bond, all you have is that basically promise that the government made you to give you the interest on your money. But you can't do anything else with it. In a corporate bond, like if a company borrows money and they don't pay the interest back, you could go and say, you didn't pay me interest, I can force you into bankruptcy. It's not the case with governments. It's just for corporations. So China, in that respect, with the bonds that they own, it's a small fraction compared to everything else. About 20% of all the bonds are owned by the Fed because they buy them across time. You have a large chunk, more than China, is owned by the trust, by the Social Security Trust, and also by other agencies within the government. So it's not something that in any way can do anything. The only thing they could do is start selling them. If they start dumping them, a lot of them, and the market there's a lot of bonds on the market, it would tank. But then they would shoot themselves in the foot because they would not get a lot on those bonds. So it's not a real concern. Yes?
Along those same lines of the national debt
Yes.
deficit, since we're talking about it, there's a lot of fear in the media about the level of the deficit and the increase in the deficit.
Yeah.
And the bond market. Could you talk
Should we talk about the debt and a little bit what's going on with that debt? So this is what's so interesting about the debt is that let's put some numbers, and I want to make sure that I'm going to give you some rough numbers, not to be overly precise. But at the beginning of this year, in 2025, as a country, we owed roughly in the order of $36 trillion with a T. A lot of money that we owed. And what's interesting is that if you look at 2021, when the previous administration, the Biden administration came along, at the time we owed roughly about $28 trillion. So over the course of 4 years, during the Biden administration, we added roughly about $2 trillion per year in national debt. If you go back one more administration, 2017, when President Trump came along for the first time, there was a little less than 20, but just to make it easy, let's say $20 trillion in debt. So over the first Trump administration, we added roughly about $8 trillion, which per year means what? $2 trillion per year. So not any differently. And in fact, if you go back to 2009, when President Obama came along, at the time, it was roughly about 11 trillion. So back then, we had about 9 trillion over 8 years, so it was roughly about 1.1 trillion per year. So over the past 8 years, both Republican and Democratic administration, the debt has been stepped up. So we've kind of did a little more in terms of that than we were during the Obama years, which was roughly half of what's been during the Trump. But what's interesting is that if you look at these numbers, it doesn't seem that having a Republican or a Democrat made much of a difference, does it? Why? Well, it turns out that when you think about the government debt and deficits, there are two types of government spending. The first type, it is called mandatory. And what it means there is that the Congress passed a law at some point saying that you have to spend money on this particular issue. The two biggest ones is like, number one, we need to give retirees Social Security. And number two is that we want the elderly to be covered by health insurance, Medicare. In fact, Medicare and Social Security amount to roughly about half of the federal budget. And that's written in the law. You can't get around that. On top of that, if you look at all the other mandatory spendings that the government said you have to spend money on, and you also put in the interest on the debt and the defense, which are kind of like necessary things, then roughly about 80% of a dollar that the government gets is spent. 80% of the budget is already spent on the mandatory spending. So what you're left with is just 20%. So it's not that much. And in fact, statistics that I heard is that you would have to cut that by 80%, the discretion, meaning like the highways, meaning the healthcare, meaning the, not the healthcare, but more like health research or FAA flight coordinators, whatever they are. You would have to cut down so much of that that it's not really feasible. So the biggest thing is that if you want to control this a little bit, you have to really address the spending on the mandatory side. And that's really hard politically because nobody wants to touch it. But maybe there's a point where they'll do it. They did in the past when we got really close to the Social Security, and they created a trust fund for that. So there are precedents where you've seen this happen. But right now, to the point is that it's a pretty sticky number because there are a lot of mandatory pieces that cannot be changed. You have to spend the money. But what's interesting about the national debt is that the number that you see so much here, this number, the 36 trillion, is actually not the most meaningful number. And why is that? Well, it turns out that when the government needs to repay, let's say, Ronnie, the money, $1,000, they can go to Tom and say, hey, Tom, if you have $1,000, why don't you lend it to me? And the government can take the $1,000 that they owe Ronnie and from Tom and pay her, which means that the government can roll the debt down the road, which is not ideal, but all the governments do it. It's been done for a long time. So in that respect, you can push that principal amount over and over and over back down the road, and you can avoid paying it. But what is it, the one thing that you cannot avoid paying? Interest. So the true burden of this is the interest that we have to pay. And this is where it gets interesting. And if you look at 2025, we owe $36 trillion. And I look back just to kind of make it an even place. 1991, at that time we owed a tenth of that, $3.6 trillion. $3.6 trillion. So we increased this tenfold. And first of all, just because the number grows, everything grows in society. So it's not really that horrific. But what's interesting is that in 1991, when we owe $3.6 trillion, if you look at the interest payments that we made relative to the size of the economy, also called the gross domestic product or GDP, that was about 3.1% of the value of all economic output of the country went into paying interest on the debt. And that was in 1991 with $3.6 trillion. Today we owe 10 times as much. What do you think that percentage is today? Huh? At the beginning of the year, 3.1%. It was identical. Identical. So why might that be the case? Well, the first obvious reason is that the economy is a lot bigger. There are more people, so I wouldn't be that shocked if things go up over time. But the other big reason, which is so interesting, is that if you look at this and you say in 2009, that's when they had the financial crisis, we had 11 trillion, now we have 36 trillion. What it basically means is that 25 trillion out of the 36 was accumulated in the past 15 years or so. So what's been remarkable about the period between 2009 and recently? Pretty much zero. the interest rates at which the government borrowed were just crazy low. So the burden of the debt was very, very low. In fact, if you want to put a number, if you look in 2021, this number was 1.4%. I mean, it was crazy low because of this. Debt being financed, particularly like the bulk of it being at very, very low rates. And what's happened over the past 3 years is that we had that COVID-related inflation, the pandemic-related inflation. The Fed has been fighting it, and interest rates have gone up. And that's why this percentage has gone up quite a bit, because the debt now gets refinanced at a higher rate. And the big question is going to be what's happening next. If the interest rates continue to stay high, that means that this number can potentially go up higher as we refinance at a higher rate. And that's the big question, is not the number itself, is at what rate you borrow money. And we got super lucky, super duper lucky with the, not with the financial crisis and the pandemic, you can't get lucky with that. But we got lucky as a country to be able to borrow at very low rates. Is that going to be the case going forward? Possibly not. Now, how are the markets assessing this? Because that's a legitimate question. So how are the markets assessing this? Is this sustainable? And it turns out that every single day, the market is voting in terms of their confidence of the ability of the government to borrow money and repay the debt. Every single second, they actually have a clear vote of confidence or not. And the way you see it, and we all pay attention to that, is at which rate can the government borrow money? So if you look not too long ago, the U.S. government, if they wanted to borrow money for 10 years, they would have to pay about 4.4% in interest to investors for 10 years. And that was the interest rate on a voluntary transaction. The government cannot force any of us to give money. We have to voluntarily say, I'm okay with that money. And as investors, we can give the money to the government, or we can give the money to somebody else. You know who else wants to borrow money? Mickey Mouse, Disney. Disney would love to pay 4.4%, but the market's saying is, you have ESPN, you have these great parks, but the reality is that if you want to borrow money, you have to pay us more as compensation for the additional uncertainty that your debt is not sustainable. And you can go down the road, great American firms, Ford can borrow money, and they would love to pay 4.4 or 5.5, but the market's saying, no. Investors are saying, if you want to borrow money, you ought to pay me more, because I don't believe that you're as trustworthy as the other entities. Macy's, great retail store, they can borrow money, it's just at a higher rate. And when a country gets in a bit of a pickle and the investors lose confidence that the country can repay the debt, they have too much. You look at Brazil. Brazil can borrow money, but they have to pay a much higher rate. So to me, the way that I would think about this is not to listen to the optimist or the pessimist. Look at the vote, because investors are voting with billions and billions of dollars, and they're telling you today, hey, on a relative basis, which one is trustworthy? And at this moment, the cornerstone is still the U.S. government. There's nothing that is more robust at this moment than the U.S. government in dollars. So could it be a day? We'll pay attention to that. Maybe we'll come talk about it later. But at this moment, it is not really something that is the market believes that somehow the government will take care of this. And if it's not, then it's going to come back and tell us, by the way, I don't believe that he is trustworthy. And the last thing I'll tell on the interest rates, folks, I have heard so much lately about people being concerned about the rates being so high. How many of you are concerned about the rates being so high? Well, it's a good thing that I can show you something. If you look at the interest rates being so high, this has been the history of the rate at which the government can borrow over 10 years. And today, it is roughly about 4.5, not vastly different than what I just shared, but it's about 4.5, 4.6, roughly in this neighborhood that was at the beginning of the year. And if you look at it visually, is this towards the highest rate that we paid as a country, or the highest rate that we've seen? Then why is everybody saying, oh, the rates are so high? Why? The reason for that is because over the past 15 years, between the financial crisis and the 2022, we went from an average of about 5.9, which is the long-term average, about 6% for the 10-year rate. We had a 2.3% average on those years. The question is, which one is the anomaly? The 2.3, we kind of got used to, like, I lived in Michigan, and there were maybe a day in January when it was like sunny and 70 degrees. Well, don't get used to that. I mean, enjoy it, but that ain't the norm. So I think we had a few sunny days in January, and we go, oh, this is great. It's going to be like, no, keep your coat. So I think that's the idea, because before the financial crisis, the average was actually about 7%. So put some perspective, folks. When you hear so much about the rates being high, don't get carried away, because they're not high by historical standards. It's high compared to our recent bias that we have after the financial crisis. And the reason that so many people are saying they're high is because you can look at the 10-year, this particular 10-year Treasury yield that I just showed you a second ago. And what's interesting is that this 10-year Treasury yield is the foundation for another widely used interest rate, which is the mortgage rate. If you look at the mortgage rate overlaid over 10 years, do you think the two of them are related? That's why a lot of folks are kind of, look at the high rates that we have for the mortgages. It's like 7%. Get a grip, because those rates of 3%, that was an anomaly. That was not the norm. Enjoy them while they last, if you had one. Because how many of you in the room might know either family members, yourself, or your parents, who might have had a 17, 18% mortgage in the 80s? So when people are complaining to you, I got to pay 7%, what do you want to do to them? Check the dose of reality, folks. It's not as bad as people think. It's not as bad as people think. Yes?
What about this idea that there aren't enough investors coming to the Treasury auction, and the Fed has to monetize that?
So that's the idea. So if there are not enough, so that's a very legitimate, and that's kind of what's been happening a little bit lately, is that you had some time when the government issues a bond, and the government kind of goes on there and say, hey, I need to sell a new bond, so I need to borrow money. And it's the first time that I need to, not an existing bond, but a new bond, and because I need to finance some new debt. So they need to sell these bonds to investors. And if they're investors who are not as keen on buying those particular bonds, and if also it turns out that they just don't show up for whatever reason, then the way that you have to incentivize them is by increasing rates. And that's what's happened a couple times over the past few months. Partly is because I think that it's not that, in my personal opinion, it's not the dollar's standing in the world that has gone down, but I believe is maybe the perception that other people around the world have about us, whether it's right or wrong. But that's kind of what's been happening. And in some ways, they're trying to show that by, hey, I'm not going to show up at your auction. If you're not going to treat me well, I'm just not going to show up. So it's possible that some of the buyers, they might just say, I'm not going to show up. And that just might be a reality. And then you have to incentivize people to come in by increasing rates. So it's not that there weren't enough folks. There weren't enough folks at that particular interest rate. When you increase the interest rate, more people are going to say, hey, for that rate, yeah, I'll show up. I don't care that I don't like you, but I'll show up because I want that interest. So there was a concern, because in fact, you heard quite often that the politicians and the administration wasn't as concerned about the stock market, but it's about the bond market. And even with the bill that's being put up in front of Congress, even the perception, ultimately what gets their attention is not the stock market, but the bond market, because it's at which rate do they have to borrow money. And the higher the rate, they realize that this could be a really big problem if the rates go up because people don't show up for those auctions. Yes?
When appropriate, I'd like you to go back to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Understanding what there is regulatory, and it seems like there's a lot of people coming into introducing new Bitcoin.
Yeah, so should we talk about Bitcoin, Eric? Bitcoin for 20?
Your floor.
20,000. So let's start with the first thing is like, what exactly is Bitcoin? Because that's an interesting kind of idea. And I have to say, if you want to understand Bitcoin, you can go back to, I'm not joking, Halloween night, 2009. It's Halloween night. And back in 2009, if you remember, there was a great deal of mistrust in the financial institutions. People didn't like financial institutions, banks in particular, the dollar, the government, all this. Like, there's a lot of skepticism about the financial world in which you lived in. So on that Halloween night, somebody anonymously published a paper under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, and nobody knows it's for one person, a group of people, but in that white paper, it's 8 pages, anybody can read and understand it, they introduce some really, really, really smart ideas. Really clever ideas, and that's why it captured to some degree people's imagination. And what were they saying in that paper? They said that we lived for the longest time, let's just call this the mainland. And on the mainland, people use dollars, and we have banks. And in order for these banks to operate, there has to be a centralized ledger. And on the centralized ledger, they keep track of who owns what. But that centralized ledger is hidden, only they can see it, and we somehow have to trust that the bank will do its job and keep the centralized ledger. But back in those days, was there a lot of trust around banks? No, people didn't like, I don't want to trust anybody. I don't trust anybody, in fact. So what that paper suggested, the very first clever thing that it suggested is that instead of living on the mainland, what they said, let us invent and come up with the island of Bitcoin. And on the island of Bitcoin, which is completely separate from the mainland of dollars, we will not have a centralized ledger that we need to trust that somebody will keep it. But rather we'll have what we call a decentralized ledger that lives on many computers around the world, and that system is built such that the same exact transactions, the same account values are written up on all these decentralized ledgers, so you cannot really forge it. It's visible to everybody, and you don't need to trust because the system itself is built strongly enough, and you can see that, to make sure that everybody sees what everybody else owns and transactions are valid. And that accounting system that is the centralized ledger that lives on so many different computers, it is called blockchain. So if you heard the word blockchain, it's just simply the way that you keep track of what ownership exists. And because this is a public viewing of everybody owns what they also said, well, on this island of Bitcoin, you don't need to put in any identifier. You just open what's called a wallet, and then that now you have access to the island of Bitcoin. So on the island of Bitcoin, there is no security checks, there's no ID, you can be completely anonymous. And that's why it has become the way of choice for the drug dealers and all the criminal, anything you do illegal, that's what you do it, all on island of Bitcoin, because there's no identification required there. So everything is anonymous. But they also said, okay, so these are the wallets, and between these wallets, we need to move something, and we're not going to move dollar bills because we're on a different island. So let's invent a token, and we're going to call the token Bitcoin. And then you can start moving these tokens between different wallets on this island. But what's brilliant about that is that in the real world, if I want to send my kid at Boulder money, it has to go from my app to my bank to his app to his bank. There are all these intermediaries, and money's like soap. The more you touch it, the less you have it. So what they said is what if we cut away all these intermediaries and money goes directly from my wallet to his wallet? Is that smart? That's pretty smart. So they said, let's invent this token called Bitcoin that can move between wallets. So Bitcoin, in fact, it's a combination of two things. One is the decentralized accounting system that only lives on the island of Bitcoin, and the second is the token itself that moves between the wallets. So far, so good? That's what it is. So it was designed to be a way that people can make payments and transfer money, and it's been about 16 years since that happened. How many of you have ever bought something legally with Bitcoin? It is not something that people use to transact. It's just not. And the only person I've ever met at an event saying, well, my neighbor had a used jacuzzi and they wanted to sell it and they took Bitcoin for it. But outside of that, I don't know anybody who used it. I mean, I also be candid. Somebody I know in high school wanted to get a fake ID, and at the time, the only way to get it is through a website, and the only form of payment they accepted, it was, guess what? Bitcoin. So anyway, so you can use it for things like that. But outside of that, it's not. It's not being, you can buy gas or milk, or you don't know the prices in Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is not really what's called a currency. Because a currency has to be a medium of exchange where people accept it. It has to have a unit of account, meaning that people quote that that price in Bitcoin. I know a gallon of gas is $3-4. I have no idea what it is in Bitcoin. And it has to be a store of value. What you can buy with it today is roughly the same you can buy yesterday and tomorrow, which is not the case with Bitcoin. It fluctuates too much in value. So it's not a currency. Let's just make it very clear. So then what exactly is Bitcoin? Well, how is it a store of value when it fluctuates 10 times more than the stock market?
Yeah, but it keeps going up in value.
Does it keep it going up in value? No. It fluctuates in value every single day. About a third of the day, you either make more than 3% or lose more than 3%. Any given.
It's gonna be 21 million Bitcoin.
So here is the argument that people make that it's a limited amount. Well, that to me is a weakness. There are two reasons for that weakness. Number one is that in order for these transactions to be validated, so when I transfer money from one wallet to the other, somebody has to buy a computer and spend money on electricity to validate a transaction, and that process is called mining. And it costs money for electricity and the computer, but the reason people do it is because you're going to get paid in Bitcoins. If you're the ones validating this little puzzle that you have to solve with a computer, and if you're the ones doing it, then you get paid in Bitcoin, and that incentivizes you to provide that service to the entire community. When the 21st millionth unit of Bitcoin is produced, what's the incentive for anybody to keep the system going if you're not going to get paid? Why would anybody spend money on computers and electricity if they're not going to get paid in Bitcoin? Would you do it? Nobody has solved that, what exactly is going to happen when that unit comes. And secondly, even more importantly, think of gold. Think of 1971. The economy was growing, there are more people in society, and you need to issue more currency. That's just the way the world works. You have more people, everything goes up in value. We drink more milk every day, we're more people in society. When you have a cap on how much gold you can produce, was that helpful for gold or was it detrimental for gold? Detrimental, because gold got replaced by something else because we just needed to produce more. We're not going to stop the population growth. We're going to keep making people. I mean, that's just the reality. I mean, not everybody, but some of us. But that's just the reality. So I don't believe that. I don't believe that is a strength. It's a weakness. Both the fact that when you reach the last Bitcoin, you're not going to have an incentive for anybody to validate transaction, and the whole blockchain system will collapse. Theoretically, because nobody had produced a solution yet. And number two is that you're going to have more people, the economy is going to get bigger, and then you have a fixed amount that's just going to be like gold, exactly like gold, which is not a good thing for it. But what people realized is that this is right now disconnected from the mainland. What if we create a ship? What if we make up a ship that can ferry somehow dollars and bitcoins between these two worlds? And it can move between the two of these worlds. And what people realize is that, hey, the ship maybe takes a dollar, and then maybe there's one Bitcoin associated with that dollar. But at some point, the same exact Bitcoin now can maybe take $2 back. So maybe it's an investment because you can make money out of it. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? It's a good thing, right? You can say, well, that's a good thing. Now, the thing that you have to consider now is that when people do this, when they do this, you have to rely on this ship. And the ship is called an exchange. And these exchanges, some of the most popular one is called Coinbase. The other one, it's a publicly traded stock. The other one is Binance. The other one was called FTX. The other one was called Mt. Gox, which went under. Tons of these exchanges that are these little ships ferrying money between these islands and the mainland. The trouble is that some of these ships sink. When FTX sank, there are $8 billion that sank with it. Coinbase, as a ship that ferries, they basically told investors that this is a real risk, that when we went to the island of Bitcoin and we wanted to buy you Bitcoins, we opened those accounts. And when we opened those accounts, legally, those accounts probably belong to Coinbase, not to you, because we opened them on your behalf. So if we get into trouble and creditors come after us, they could come after those Bitcoins that you thought belonged to you. And they put them into a letter to investors. So it's not like Schwab or Fidelity where you have your lockbox and nobody can touch it. In this case, that doesn't belong to you if you go through Coinbase. And so I think that there's a real operational risk associated with these ships. That's the first risk. By the way, and they also have a centralized ledger that you wanted to avoid to begin with. Now, what if you swim yourself? Like, what if you paddle there and you swim yourself to the island of Bitcoin and you open your own account? You can do that. You can do all of you can do it. The trouble with that is that there is no law enforcement on the island. You talked about the administration. They basically made sure that if there was any sort of a police station on that island, no, we're gonna tear it down. There is no law enforcement. There is no toll-free number to call, nothing. You are on your own completely. And it's a lawless land. I told you about the lady who lost the money. There's so much fraud because it is no man's land. There's manipulation. There's all kinds of things of that nature, which is a real risk. And associated with that is that you're on your own because you opened that wallet where your Bitcoin live and you swam yourself. But at that point, you also are responsible for logging in. The true story, one of my friends had a daughter who bought $200 worth of Bitcoin in 2011 because she wanted to do something with it. I'm not going to tell you what, but she wanted to do something with it. And during the pandemic, she found a laptop. She looked at her notes and she saw, oh boy, I have some Bitcoins in this wallet. So she did a quick math and the $200 had turned into $62 million. $62 million. And she was like so happy, like, ooh, this is life-changing. So she goes in and she tries to log in. Puts in the password the first time, didn't work. Puts in the second time, doesn't work. And by the third time, she's like, well, I don't remember exactly the password. And she digs in the line a little bit, and what she finds out is that you only have 10 attempts to put in your password. After the 10th attempt, that account is locked up forever by the system. She has tried 8 so far, and she hasn't done the last 2 years any new attempts. I mean, but what do you do? And it is estimated that about a third of all Bitcoins are locked up because people forgot their passwords. How many of you have not forgotten a password at some point? So it is a real risk. That's a real risk. So not only that the ships present a risk, not only there is fraud and you have operational risk, but the other big risk is that this was the very first island that was invented. Subsequently, people realized, boy, this island has some inefficiencies. Like, it's very slow to process a transaction. You can't really transact very fast. You can't really exchange. You can't go buy a coffee with Bitcoin because it would take about 15 minutes for that to happen. So you kind of like have to come back in 15 minutes to get a coffee. It takes a long time. Visa, how long does it take for the Visa transaction to be? It's instant. So it's not really built for that. And also, it's a dumb system because all they can do is move money. So not long after, somebody came up with the idea, well, why don't we do a different island? We're going to invent a different island. Let's just call this the island of Ethereum, which is a competing island to Bitcoin, exactly the same idea of a blockchain, but instead of being the Bitcoin blockchain, it's got its own system, its own blockchain on that island, and it's smart. It only releases money from one account to another if a certain condition is met. So if you kind of put that in there, that'll release the money. And those are called smart contracts. And that, do you think it's a step forward to Bitcoin? In some ways it could be. It could be because unless I see the title being put in there, I'm not going to release the money for the car, whatever it is, man. But the smart contract is a step forward to Bitcoin, which is a pretty simple system. So right now, guess how many of these islands exist out there? Thousands of these islands. Thousands of these islands. And not only that, but some of them are being, and they all have no purpose. They're just like an island that somebody made up. The most recent one, the president has his own island. And everybody, like, but what's the value? What's the point? You tell me. But how is it? Because the only way you can make money is you have to somehow come back to the mainland of dollars, because you can't spend money. You can't spend money on that island. You have to somehow bring it back to the dollar land, because we all live on the mainland. We don't live on that islands. If you want to live on that island, knock yourself out. There's not much to buy. But I think that this idea of being an investment has caught people's imagination. And I'm not, yeah, it's gone up in value. And I'm not saying like that's not real. It's just that there are a few things that I'm going to kind of like suggest to you, is that if you think of it as an investment, The way that most professional investors look at investing is like this. If you buy Apple stock, Apple sells iPhones, and I can look down the road, and based on that economic activity, what profits do I expect it to make? If you look at any company, you can estimate and value how much it's worth to buy that. The same with a building. You collect rent, you kind of figure out if it's a good deal or not. In the case of Bitcoin, does it have any economic activity? Nothing. So then how do people value something that has no economic activity? And in my mind, there's a single word: sentiment. And back in August, this is when it became clear to me. Back in August, one of my buddies said, "Why don't you come with me to the Dodgers game because they're going to pass out some bubbleheads?" I was like, why would I want to go all the way downtown to get bubbleheads? Like, I'm not going to do that. And then not long after, just to kind of show me how smart I am at picking things, he sent me a picture of eBay where a bubblehead that was passed at that game for Shohei Ohtani, the baseball guy, was selling for $1,500. One bubblehead. And I was like trying to tell, dude, that's crazy. Who in the world would be dumb enough to pay $1,500 for a bubblehead? And just to show me, not long after, when they got to the World Series, the same bubblehead was selling for $20,000. $20,000. But he didn't play very well, he got hurt, and by the end, it was $1,000, which is still crazy. Today is about $200. But when you folks are laughing at somebody paying $20,000 for a bubblehead, what is the difference between that and paying $100,000 for something that lives on the island of Bitcoin? What's the difference? What does it do for you? Nothing. And not only that, but there's another big thing that I'm not going to talk too much about it, but when you think about this idea of Bitcoin, it is absolutely something you can make a lot of money. I'm not going to say don't do it. I just think that you ought to buy it because it says something about you, because it has a non-financial value. Not necessarily because because it's pure speculation where it's go from here. And the only time that I researched and I looked, and was there a moment in time when there might have been some collective delusion of some sort? I mean, I'm not saying it's delusion right now, but it is a little bit like, what exactly are you buying? It has no economic activity, no way to value, doesn't do anything. So when was the last time that I saw this happening? And from my way back in my econ days, I realized there was a moment in time when that happened, and that was in the Netherlands in the 1600s. And back in those days, collectively, the Dutch society believed that a bulb of a tulip that creates a flower that's pretty. There's no doubt it's pretty, but that bulb is worth as much as a house. Because why? It's going to keep going up in value. It's going to keep. Why wouldn't it go up in value? And they were doubling. I was like, why would I buy the house when I can buy this bulb that's going to double in value? Until one day somebody woke up and was like, it's a bulb of a tulip. What exactly am I doing here? And then it completely collapsed. And people were making soup out of those after. It really collapsed. But, to me, if you really want to own Bitcoin, I'm not saying don't do it. Absolutely, because they're worth, you can buy the bubbleheads for 20 grand, that's fine. But do it because, not necessarily because it helps your financial life. Rather because it says something about you, because it's interesting to you, it's appealing, it's kind of fun. Do it for those reasons, but not because you would help your financial plan. It's too small of a piece. If you add up all the Bitcoins in the world at the end of the year, it was less than $2 trillion, which seems like a tremendous amount of money. It's a little bit less, it's a little more than half of the value of all these islands that I mentioned, the crypto islands. Now, compare that with one single stock, Apple. All the Bitcoin is half the value of Apple. You look at the entire US stock market compared to Bitcoin, and you look at all the stocks that you can buy in the world. How meaningful is Bitcoin, even if you were to buy it? Is that meaningful of a value in the world? 0.0% nothing. I mean, it's a tiny fraction, and even if you were to put it in there, it would just be such a small portion that begs the question, is the juice worth the squeeze? So at the moment, I can tell you that if you want to do it for the right reasons, not because it helps your plans. Yes, let me make sure.
I just want to make sure, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't talk tariffs today.
Oh, yeah, tariffs. Let's talk tariffs, and I'll come back. So tariffs. Okay, so let's start with
I know-
tariffs.
I can see people have a lot of Bitcoin questions and crypto questions, but
Let's do tariffs. Tariffs for 20. So tariffs are interesting because I had a conversation not too long ago with a group very similar to this, and I was asked somebody, kind of, what's your understanding of tariffs? Well, it's a fine that we impose on foreign producers because they want to sell us things and steal jobs from Americans. And I thought, like, it's interesting because tariffs are a jargon that we understand as economists, but not necessarily something that it's in the public domain. So is it worth kind of taking 2 minutes and explaining what exactly is a tariff and how it works? So I'll do that by kind of looking at my life, and I'm not Buddy the Elf, but I love maple syrup. I mean, I put on everything, not spaghetti like he did, but yogurt and everything. So if you think of maple syrup, I buy it at Costco. So let's kind of look at the good old days with no tariffs. Costco wanted to put maple syrup on the shelf, and they would go to Vermont producers and said, listen, sell me some maple syrup. And they would say, yeah, I'll sell you some maple syrup. And they would, buy as much as they can, but it turns out there are not as many maple syrup trees in the US, but there are a lot more on the other side of the border in Canada. So Costco would also go to the Canadian producers and say, can I buy from you nice Canadian producers some maple syrup? And they say, yes, I'll sell it to you for, let's say, $20 a bucket. And Costco said, great, I'll take it for $20 a bucket. And then they have to add a few dollars for their employees, for their warehouse, for their profit. So let's say they add $5. So I can go pick it up for $20 for the producer, $5 for Costco. I pay $25. I'm happy. I take it home. All good. So far, so good? That's in the good old days of no tariff. Now, President Trump comes along and says, no, we're going to put 25% tariff on everything that comes from Canada, and let's say maple syrup is included in that. So at this point, the importing company, in this case Costco, is legally responsible to send the government a check that is worth 25% of the value of what they import. So if what they import is $20, 25% of that is $5. So Costco is legally responsible to pay the government $5 for what they bring in. Now, where's Costco going to get the $5 from? Well, one thing they could do is go to the producers and say, hey, you Canadian producers, the government wants me to send them $5. Why don't you sell this maple syrup to me for $15? So by the time I send the government the $5, nothing changes. What do you think the producers are going to say? No chance, little buddy. No chance. I mean, like, where are you exactly going to get? It's not like you plant a maple tree and then you get syrup right away. No, it's like, where else are you going to get the maple syrup? Plus, that's what it takes me to produce it. I can't lower my price. So they stick to $20. So Costco has no choice to say, great, I'll pay you the $20. The second option is that, if the producers don't want to pay, is that Costco can say, I'll take the $5 that I used to make and I'm going to ship that to the government. Will they do that? No, it's not a business that's feasible. What's the third alternative? They're going to say, I need to raise the price, and the additional money that I collect, I'm going to send to the government. And that's what's interesting about tariffs, is there's not, even though the importing company is legally responsible for paying it, there are three entities involved: the producer, the importing shop, and the consumer. And who pays what is not clear at all. And when during the first Trump administration, there was a 20% tariff on washing machines, economists actually did look to see, well, who paid that 20%? And here's what they found. 12 out of the 20%, so more than half of the tariff, was passed on to consumers in the form of a higher price. So we paid more for it. And the rest were haircuts that the producer and the importing company took. And that's why you hear so much about possibly prices going up, because look at the situation. In reality, who's going to pay that money to the government? If the producers don't want to take it and if the importers don't want to take it, we are going to pay for more. Now, for some products, it might be less. For some products, more. So it depends on product by product. But again, that's the experience that we had with the washing machines. And the trouble is that if you're the importing company or the producer, and you're kind of saying, well, I'm losing money here. If I'm the CEO, I'll be, okay, I'm losing money on this, but what else can I do to make it up? Well, what goes with the purchase of a washer? A dryer. Dryers were not subject to any tariffs, yet their prices went up. You make it up any way you can. So there might be other ways that they're going to make money, but they're going to make money and we're still going to pay. So I'm not I'm just saying it depends on product by product, but by and large, I think a lot of people are kind of expecting and seeing that this is a tax that we have to pay. It's not called a tax. And Amazon did want to kind of say, hey, prices go up and actually attribute it to the tariff, but they got shut down politically. But the reality is that it is a tax, and it's not clear who pays it. But it's quite likely that a good chunk of it will pass on to consumers, but it depends on product by product. Now, why do we even have tariffs to begin with? And it's interesting because that goes back to the founding fathers. Because if you go back to 1776, 80% of the government revenue was generated through tariffs back in those days. 80%. So tariffs are nothing new. 80% of the money for the government came from tariffs in 1776. And that was the case up until about the Civil War. And during the Civil War, that era, that's when they introduced the income tax. And since then, income tax became the #1 source of revenue for the government. And last year, what percentage of the government budget do you think came from tariffs? It was 80% back in 1776. Last year, what do you think it was? 2%. Tiny fraction. Tiny fraction. So when people are saying we're going to generate more revenue, yeah, you are, but you're going to go from $2 to $2.50. So it's not really a tremendous part of the budget. The second reason is restrictions, that we want to protect industries, whether because they're strategically important or we want to keep jobs in the U.S. And that was the reason between between actually Civil War and World War II. But after World War II, we had this third reason, which is reciprocity. So the revenue, reciprocity, and restrictions. But reciprocity is an interesting one because what the U.S. championed was a different way of thinking. What if we let goods flow freely between countries? Could that benefit everybody? And the reality is, how do you feel about that? Did it benefit people or not? I think it benefited the society at large, and it hurt certain pockets of people. I think we all benefited because, frankly, how many of you put up Christmas decorations? The fact that you can go to Home Depot and buy them for relatively affordable prices was because of global trade. Now, pockets of people got hurt. For sure, and I travel the country and I know they got hurt. And I'm not sure that they got the help that they needed. But those pockets of people also became very vocal. And that's what politicians are paying attention to a lot more. In other words, a large swath of the population benefited, but nobody says a word because that's the nature of thing. A small number get very vocal for real because they got really hurt in this process, and everybody listens to them a lot more disproportionately. So to me, it's real that for sure that jobs got lost. I do believe that all benefited, but my sense is that after 80 years, it is nearly impossible at the moment in a short time to put the cat back in the bag and say, we want to go back to the way things were in the 30s. You just can't. And the reason for that is because it's 80 years where companies have built their business around the idea of globalization and global trade and free movements of good. And to give you an example, how many of you have heard of this company called NVIDIA? You've all heard of NVIDIA. NVIDIA is an amazing success story of American artificial intelligence. And it's an amazing company. And what they do is they design chips that are really well suited for data centers that process AI, artificial intelligence. And they've gone bastard. They're just amazing in that space. But NVIDIA is pretty much like a baker who came up with a recipe for the best cookie in the world. That's what they do. They have the best cookie in the world. The trouble is they don't have a kitchen. In other words, they have no manufacturing capacity. They don't have any factories. And in the entire world, there's only one company who over decades perfected a system to create these processors, which is incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to do it, and no other company, Intel couldn't do it, nobody else in the world can do it. And that's the only company that can produce the high-end NVIDIA chips. And that company happens to be based in Taiwan. It's called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. It's the only kitchen that can bake these great NVIDIA cookies. Is it realistic to say that somehow we're going to reinvent TSMC after decades in the US, after all the engineers and the time that they put in there and the systems they developed? Unrealistic. On the other hand, this kitchen needs an incredibly specialized oven. And this machine that produces something called lithography is incredible, and it's just science fiction. There's only one company in the entire world who took decades to develop this machine. And when I'm saying science fiction, Eric, I'm not kidding. It is basically science fiction. It engraves processors at a size that is 10,000 times smaller than the human hair. Not mine, but Eric's maybe. 10,000 times smaller. They have a laser that is so precise that if they shot it from this building to the moon, it would hit a ping pong ball. They have like from Germany, they have a mirror that is so precise that if you put that mirror over the entire state of Colorado, the biggest imprecision would be 1 millimeter. It is science fiction. It's a global supply chain. Nobody else in the world was able to produce anything close to that. And that company is based in the Netherlands, and it's called ASML. And without those ASML machines, NVIDIA, TSMC couldn't produce anything, and with the TSMC, NVIDIA couldn't sell anything. Is it possible to say that somehow global trade should go away? No. And that's why I think a lot of the market and the economists are kind of looking and saying, well, this is not realistic to say that we can somehow skip all over this and then kind of make everything in the U.S. It's just not realistic because we have 80 years, which worked pretty well for everybody except these pockets of people that could have gotten better help. Now, for you as an investor, what does it mean? Well, what it means for you as an investor, you can kind of go back to the first Trump administration. You can go see what happened in those days because if you look at the first Trump administration, there are headlines around trade that kind of happen over and over and over again. Like there was all these noise about trade. And what did the market do? And what can we learn from those 4 years of a lot of trade talk? Well, the U.S. stock market, the S&P 500, over the course of the 4 years of the Trump administration, all the tariff talk, it actually increased in value by about 80%. So $1 would have turned into $1.80 in about 4 years. That's actually a really nice outcome for 80% growth in a particular 4-year period. Now the question is, what about the markets that we are targeting? Like what was the big country that we're trying to push back against? China. So the question is, as an investor, are you somehow better off pulling back from those countries because they might get hurt? And we certainly made a big push to try to impact their economy and the market. So how badly do you think it got for the Chinese market? It didn't go up by 80%. It actually went up by 100%. It outperformed the U.S. market despite being at the receiving end of the sanctions. This year, the U.S. market's pretty much flat or maybe a little bit down. China is up about 15%. Mexico is up. Canada's up. Germany's up. All these countries that we are targeting are up, and our own market is down a little bit. Not much, pretty much flat. But in other words, tariffs don't seem to be the primary driver of the stock market. They're just not. There are too many other variables that matter, and this is one of the many, many, many variables that matter, but it's not the driving force behind the stock market. So as much as you hear, what I can tell you is that for U.S. consumers, it's likely that if tariffs stick, you never know what's going to happen next, but if the tariffs stick, then it's likely that you will see higher prices and fewer choices because a lot of the businesses might not even import things. For businesses, it's a matter of reinventing how they do things. And then thirdly, for the market, it's not a major event to kind of say that should give me a reason to trade or not trade. Yes?
Not to digress, but I don't know if you want to spend any time on it. A while ago, you mentioned something about Social Security and Medicare and how that took up a big portion of the budget or deficit. Isn't that kind of self-funded by the people who are paying into it, and why not attack it in that sense?
So the question is, what about the Social Security and the tariff and the Medicare? Let's catch up afterwards because it is a pretty niche question. But the bottom line is that there is a trust fund for Social Security that has been depleted, that has kind of gone up and up and up in value. But for the past few years, we've taken money out of it, and it's going to run down. But it's a spending that the government has to do. But they also collect money through Social Security. It's supposed to take money for the young and give it to the old. But at least at this point, there's some additional money that comes from the trust fund.
Just in the interest
Yes.
of time, we'll take one more question.
Yeah.
But I'm going to bring Apollo back next week.
Anytime. I love it here. Thanks, Eric.
Go ahead, we'll take one more question.
Do we have a sense of what the constant on-off with the tariffs is doing?
Do we have a sense? And the reality is that the first big thing is that with tariffs, that there's a specific court that was designated by the U.S. This is like, legally speaking, there's a court specifically for commerce and tariffs. And that court not too long ago kind of said that you can't invoke certain, like the laws that were invoked to kind of have this blanket tariffs because it's hurting too many people indiscriminately. So they basically said that tariffs, the way they were, are just not legal. And then right after that, there was a court that kind of says, hey, let's kind of put that holding a roll until the appeal goes on, which is a pretty normal thing. But what happens next is going to depend on the legal proceedings, which are at this point, they're kind of a toss-up. But the reality is that the court that is specifically looking at tariffs and commerce kind of said that those are the tariffs are not legal. But that remains to be seen. But the trouble is that a lot of times some of these announcements, at least the one you pick up in the paper, and I'm not a huge expert, but just reading the paper, it turns out that people who are involved in that, they get surprised themselves by the announcements that are being made. Oh, I didn't know that. So it's a very kind of ad hoc policy that is happening. I don't know, maybe there is a strategic thinking behind it, but at least at this point, like, it doesn't appear that people have a sense of what is the end game. What exactly do we want? Because I was just in Singapore, and people there are a little confused because they said, well, if you're talking about reciprocity, we have no tariffs on American goods and services. Why are we being taxed if it's truly reciprocal? So,
All right, well, as maybe next time I'll have to do this. But yeah, let's start by just giving Paula a round of applause.
thanks.